Welcome to EER's webinar. We're gathered 4 years after the fall of the Islamic State's caliphate. The group continues to operate in Syria and Iraq, but the focus here will be somewhat beyond that. In Afghanistan, in Africa, and elsewhere, the group has built strongholds, continued to operate, and to pose new kinds of challenges. To discuss this, we've gathered with us two experts. First, Pieter Van Ostaeyen, who studied medieval history with a specialization on the Crusades and Arab and Islamic history, focusing on Saladin al-Ayyubi and the Assassins. Pieter's studied Syria, the conflict since it began in 2011, especially the foreign fighter flows, and has recently been focused on the Sahel and the operations of the jihadist groups in that theatre. And we have Jacob Zenn, who's an adjunct assistant professor of the graduate level course Violent and Interstate Actors in World Politics at Georgetown University's Security Studies program. He's also a senior fellow on African and Eurasian Affairs at the Jamestown Foundation. If we go over to you, Pieter, for 15-20 minutes. Thank you.
I wish you a very good evening. Ever since 2019, I started following the Sahel region, and especially the interferences of the Islamic State in that particular region. We wrote an extensive paper on that, covering an entire year, and we already predicted that the problem would grow bigger. And basically what we see right now, that the problem is only exacerbating over the last few years. It's not just a question of Mali anymore, as it was before, but the entire problem has been spreading throughout the region, especially since France has withdrawn its troops under the pressure of the Malian government, and now is also thrown out of Burkina Faso. Other European nations are also retracting their troops and are refusing to risk their materials and lives inside the Sahel in fighting a growing jihadi insurgency. If we look at, for example, a comparison 2021 to 2022, we see an increase of jihadi violence throughout the Sahel, especially Al-Qaeda related violence, with over 100%. As I'm currently working on a project for the counter-extremism project and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, covering jihadi activities throughout the Sahel from December 22 to December 23, I'm particularly well aware of what is going on a weekly basis. If we look, for example, at last month, we see that there were 52 different attacks claimed by these groups. And by claimed, I mean officially claimed on Telegram channels owned by the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda. So basically, we're dealing with three groups here in my count. The Islamic State in Western Africa province, the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, and Jainim, Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam or Muslimin, or Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, basically. The number of attacks has risen significantly since last month. There were 52 claims this month. Most of them came from Nigeria, where the Islamic State in Western Africa province is operating, and on second hand, the Al-Qaeda followed up. There was only one recorded attack from the Islamic State in Greater Sahara, but that was directed against Al-Qaeda. So jihadi groups inside the Sahel are not only fighting government forces, the main targets all the time, army, gendarmerie, police, go on, but they're also infighting against themselves. We have the issue of Boko Haram, the breakaway faction of the Islamic State in Western Africa, which is still fighting and which is still engaged in the continuous battle throughout Mali, for example, and Nigeria especially. If we have to look forward, I would say that the situation will only get worse on a short time. Ramadan has started about a few weeks ago, and it's going to last till April. And Ramadan is usually seen as a month for battle for jihadis. It's a month of jihad, definitely. So the Ramadan campaign has maybe started yet throughout the Sahel. It only has just kicked off in Syria and Iraq, the heartland, as Aaron Zenn recently pointed out. Now the Sahel will see increasing violence in the coming few weeks. That's at least my expectation. Not sure whether I can add anything more to this. I don't know how long I've been talking, but I think I made my point.
I think so. Jacob is still delayed from us, so I wonder if we could start with questions from you. The audience can put questions in the chat if they want, and I will attend to them. You mentioned the recent increase in the attacks. Is that just Ramadan related? It's not part of a broader trend. It's just them acting because of the
it's just
the event.
It's an ongoing. It is an ongoing trend since 2019, basically. If we look at, for example, the violence throughout the Sahel, let me look up the exact numbers. I don't want to say something stupid. I have to be absolutely sure about what I'm going to say. Bon. In the last 16 years alone, incidents in the Sahel, jihadi-related incidents, increased by over 2,000%. Source on that is unheard.com. It's an article I recently published on my LinkedIn site. So you can see that it's an ongoing trend. It's been increasing since long, ever since the conflict in Mali started, basically, and now recently, when they kicked out the French, the Wagner Group has taken over the place of the French, and the Wagner Group is only exacerbating the problem. They are not solving the problem. They are even attacking civilians and go on. So the presence of the Wagner Group is highly alarming. Basically, also because we know that they have contracts with mineries and whatever to take out the precious gold and minerals and gems from Africa and ship them to Putin's war machine.
The Russians have also moved in other states as well throughout the region. There's been this series of coups, military coups in West Africa and into Central Africa as well, and the Russians seem to follow in their wake. Has the pattern held across the whole region that where the Russians go, counter-terrorism efforts fail?
I wouldn't say so. They're, in a way, they are enforcing each other. As soon as the Russians take over a place or take control over a village or whatever, jihadis attack them, counter-reaction, and it's It's an infinite circle, basically. Don't forget also that the Russians have been implicated in mass murders, basically, also conducted by the armies throughout the Sahel. So the situation right now is very, very alarming, and I don't think that there is enough attention going there from our Western Western Union, if I may call so, maybe even NATO. We withdrew as soon as the French withdraw. Belgium decided not to engage in Mali. So basically Mali is now left over to jihadis and the Wagner.
Unfortunate for anybody. Is there anything the West can now do? I'm assuming putting the military back in is off the table, but are there steps we can take from the outside to mitigate the disaster?
No, as you said, military is off the table. I don't think we're ever going to engage military again inside these countries unless some kind of disaster happens. And in my idea, that's only a matter of time, basically. I'm not really expecting any new attacks from the Islamic State, for example, in Europe, but we already saw clear evidence of formerly engaged recruiters who did go to Western Africa with suspicious means in mind. Give you an example, in February, Jean-Louis Denis Le Soumis, one of the main recruiters for Sharia for Belgium 10 years ago, he was arrested in Benin for suspicious activities and thrown out of the country because he didn't have the specific papers needed. But anyway, he was engaged in a sort of an agricultural project. At least that's what he said. But if you looked at the regions in Benin he visited, those are the exact regions where the Islamic State was active. So I don't think he was just on an agricultural trip, but he was actually engaged again in recruiting, although nothing has been proven. He's free and he's on Twitter. You can follow his Hijra Culture account.
Lovely. The Islamic State seems to have these outposts in Africa. Beyond they've also got the Congo and Mozambique, where they have kind of active theaters. But then they have Somalia, and I think South Africa is getting more attention recently as a node in their network. Is Benin heading in a similar direction, or is it it's too early to say yet?
No, I think we can be quite sure about the fact that the problem will only spread throughout the borders. It's not going to be Mali, Nigeria, Burkina Faso. It's going to spread to Cote d'Ivoire, to Benin. It's almost certain. Don't forget that mostly the areas where these guys are operating, like for example in the Borno, if I'm not mistaken, the Borno region in Nigeria, it largely coincides with a national park. So that's rough terrain, and they can easily operate from there. We have seen the same thing in Congo in the last few years. In Congo, most of the Islamic State troops seem to be hiding out just across the borders with Virunga Park, just coming out for attacks and claiming massive amounts of casualties.
We have a question sent in to us here about China and what role it's playing in the region and what role its influence has, whether I guess positive or negative.
I'm not especially specialized in China, but what I can tell you is what I know, that they're also engaged in mining companies there, and their most important project might be a sort of African railway. They're heavily investing in infrastructure there. So the role of China is significant. Yes, indeed. And it seems like Europe and NATO in general is in a way, how should I put it gently, maybe ignoring a bit the problems in Africa, but it's going to cost us dearly.
Okay, then it's obviously very close to Europe's southern border. The problems, as you say, you don't expect terrorism within Europe, at least not in the immediate run. Is the kind of thing that you imagine more like with refugees and piracy in the seas, or yeah, what kind of spillover do you expect from Africa to Europe?
Yeah, especially refugees, of course. We saw that phenomenon started a few years ago already, and it's continuous. We see daily, we see reports about refugees rescued or, in the worst case, drowned at sea. I'm not expecting this to stop anytime soon. Since the problem is growing day by day, I don't think that anything will keep these refugees away from Europe.
In terms of the intra-jihadi competition in the Sahel, you mentioned Islamic State in Nigeria seems to be clearly the most powerful. I think other than Ansaru, Al-Qaeda's presence is fairly minimal in Nigeria. But elsewhere, it looks as if Al-Qaeda probably has the upper hand, or is that changing as we go by, as time goes by?
No, if we look, for example, at the trends of last month, if I may, I'm just going to pull up my report, then I can give you the exact numbers.
Go for it.
So I told you already we had a total number of attacks of 52. Current situation, France declared the entire zone, Mali, Chad, Niger, Burkina Faso, no-go zones. The majority of Mauritania is a no-go zone. If we look at the attacks and the most deadly attacks in the last few months, reported in March, I mean, we have one attack in Burkina Faso, 70 killed, dozens wounded. One attack in Nigeria, 45 killed. Burkina Faso, dozens killed. Those were all attacks by the Islamic State in Western Africa province. And we have one attack by the Islamic State in Greater Sahara, that's in Mali, in Menaka. 40 killed, and those were all Al-Qaeda members. And then we have another attack two attacks by the Islamic State in Western Africa in Dikwa in Nigeria, and another one in Dikwa, in which in total 80 people were killed. So it's problem right now lies with the Islamic State. Most of the attacks that were conducted last month by Zenn were actually very low level. We only have one bigger attack, but most of the attacks were very low in impact. Only a few killed, one Kalashnikov, one car damaged, stuff like that.
I see. Thank you for this. We do have Jacob at last, so we're just going to go over to him for his presentation, and then we'll come back with some more questions.
All right.
Thank you. Jacob,
hello, everyone.
welcome.
Thank you very much for having me for the webinar. I apologize for entering somewhat late. Can everyone hear me fine?
Yeah, we can hear you well.
Great. So I'll talk about Islamic State in West Africa Province, otherwise known as ISWAP. As people who follow the group know, the term Boko Haram refers to actually three factions. ISWAP is the main one that's affiliated to Islamic State. Then there's a second faction, which was led by the ruthless Abu Bakr Shekau until he was killed by ISWAP in 2021. So now we refer to that faction as the late Shekau faction. And then there's a third faction that's aligned with Al-Qaeda called Ansarut. And that one exists mostly in the Northwest, and it really hasn't succeeded in lifting off. In part because for a long time, the late Shekau faction and ISWAP were cracking down upon it. So in terms of the spread of ISIS beyond Iraq and Syria into the Sahel and Nigeria, the group to focus on is mostly ISWAP. The situation for ISWAP currently is something that I am now coining chronic terrorism. And this is because ISWAP is so consolidated now in Nigeria that it appears that there's no event on the horizon in which the group can be defeated. And even the strategies that the Nigerian government is taking don't appear set to even attempt to remove the group from the rural areas. For example, in Syria and Iraq in 2019, you had a massive counter-ISIS campaign, and the goal was to rid the group of the territory that it holds. I don't see any strategy in Nigeria anymore to say we need to get rid of the control of territory that ISWAP has. And this is actually a sea change, because in the election in 2015, when Muhammad Buhari won the first of his two terms, the second began in 2019, the goal was to defeat Boko Haram. And he infamously said that Boko Haram is being technically defeated, even though that, of course, wasn't the case. But the idea was to defeat the group. Nigeria just had an election 1 month ago, and Boko Haram was very removed for the agenda. In other words, to win a presidential election in Nigeria now, you don't need to say that we're going to defeat Boko Haram. You don't even need to say we're going to roll back Boko Haram. It's almost as if the situation is accepted. And so for ISWAP, what this essentially means is that its ability to administer its Sharia Hispa patrols or taxation in the rural areas, or to train a new group of fighters in the rural areas of northeastern Nigeria is largely unobstructed now. The reason why Nigeria is able to implement the strategy that it is in terms of not defeating the group is that the super camps strategy that the government and military have implemented is largely successful. All of the medium to large sized towns in northeastern Nigeria now are essentially fortresses. And ISWAP has not proven capable of overcoming those fortresses. In contrast, prior to the super camp strategy around 5 years ago, ISWAP consistently overran military outposts. So basically the deal now in northeastern Nigeria is the Nigerian army gives ISWAP the rural areas, and it has a pretty free reign to operate there. And ISWAP leaves the mid to large sized towns to the control of the government. And I think that status quo is actually fairly acceptable to each side. ISWAP does not really need to worry too much about ambushes on its hideouts. Not to say they never happen, but it generally can live freely and unobstructed in its type of Islamic State that it desires. And the Nigerian government doesn't get the embarrassment of losing major towns. Now, in terms of ISWAP's relationships with other provinces in Africa, I think there's also been a sea change in the last 5 years or so. Before the collapse of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, there was a lot of communication with the center. So it was largely directed from the caliph or his administration in Iraq and Syria to each individual province. I think now what you're seeing with ISWAP, including the recent arrest of an Algerian who claimed to have been in touch with ISWAP, is that the provinces in Africa are working more horizontally. Instead of vertically through ISIS center, you now have ISWAP communicating with IS Sahel and even the remaining IS members in Algeria. And then you've had a decent amount of communications between IS Congo and IS Mozambique. and even their liaisons that exist in South Africa. It's unconfirmed, but due to the high level of conflict that has existed within the leadership of ISWAP, there are some people who work closely to the inner circle of ISWAP who have suggested that some members of ISWAP have also went to the Sahel to work with ISGS. And by doing so, ISWAP can provide Islamic State in Greater Sahara Province some additional capability or training or even financing to help ISGS in its combat, not only against the regional armies, but also against the Al-Qaeda affiliate JNIM. And that also points to one of the benefits that ISWAP obtains by controlling territory. Even if it's not conducting the major attacks that people often associate with ISIS, ISWAP is still able to, retain funds from taxation, from agriculture, from the black market. And it can very potentially use that to support the other IS provinces in Africa, and most specifically, ISGS. Now, another development that I'll also mention before I move on is that last year, ISWAP did move into southern Nigeria, which was something that we had not seen from ISWAP or any of the other factions in around 10 years. And that was claims of attacks in Ondo and Edo, which are close to Lagos and near the oil-producing areas of the country. These were small-scale attacks, but they clearly evidence that ISWAP does have cells in the south. So I would suspect that if IS wants to show the world that it still has a presence around the world and it needs to gain headlines due to its struggles elsewhere, it could use ISWAP to launch one of those types of attacks on hotels or attacks on government offices or a major kidnapping of oil executives or something of the sort in southern Nigeria to gain international headlines. I think what might be restricting that type of attack, given that we know that ISWAP has those capabilities and is active in southern Nigeria, is that it really could backfire from the plan that I mentioned in the beginning, which is the status quo that exists in northeastern Nigeria. If ISWAP were to do something that really harmed the international community, like attacking the United Nations, which the Shekau faction did in 2012, or conducting some other major attack on a hotel, like JNIM's predecessors had done in the Sahel in like 2015, 2016 era, then it would make it more likely that the international community and the Nigerian government would put additional pressure on ISWAP in northeastern Nigeria. And currently, ISWAP actually benefits from the fact that the international community is not focused on the group nearly as much as it used to be. Like when Chibok was the main headline around the world, various governments felt they had to do something about Boko Haram and the fact that they kidnapped the Chibok schoolgirls. So they provided money, weapons, additional training to the Nigerian government. And nowadays, you have ISWAP defeated to a certain extent, at least territorially, in Iraq and Syria. So ISWAP is not, ISIS is not making the headlines. And I think, therefore, governments don't feel like they need to provide Nigeria as much support as they used to combat the ISIS province in West Africa. And currently, the international community is so focused on Russia and Ukraine, if not also China, Taiwan, and these geopolitical issues in Eurasia, that the issue of Boko Haram or ISWAP is really on the back burner of the agenda. And I think that actually favors ISWAP. They don't want the Nigerian government to receive more international pressure to do something about the territory that ISWAP holds, let alone give Nigerian army additional training. So what I see for the foreseeable future is a very comfortable hold on the rural areas for ISWAP, which in the short term or medium term might not lead to any major developments, but in the long term, I think it very well might, because you're having so many children growing up in the ranks of ISWAP. And my colleagues and I actually have an article coming out about this in Small Wars and Insurgencies, that ISWAP doesn't even need to recruit from outside of its own fighters anymore. With 6,000 to 10,000 fighters and all the children that are growing up and even becoming commanders that you see in videos now, they have enough fighters to sustain themselves for the long term. And I think one generation from now, given that I don't see Nigerian the Nigerian army ridding the group until one generation from now, I think ISWAP could try to make a push at those major towns again. So I'll conclude it at that, just noting that ISWAP is the major factor in Nigeria. The late Shekau faction is not particularly effective right now, and if anything, its members are being absorbed into ISWAP, and that only makes ISWAP stronger. And the Al-Qaeda aligned faction is struggling to exist, again, perhaps because it has been losing members to the very strong contingent, namely ISWAP.
Thanks, Jacob. I just want to follow up with you with a couple of questions first, and then we'll throw it open to audience questions and bring Pieter back in. When you mentioned about the attacks in the south and the cells that ISIS or ISWAP has there, but simultaneously that Nigerian politics has kind of adjusted to accepting this pseudo caliphate in the north. Is that a kind of how would you say, a universal thing? Because you'd imagine that the Christian population in the south would be at least somewhat hesitant about leaving this jihadist statelet on its kind of front door.
Well, I would say that's also the fact that ISWAP has not been attacking much in central Nigeria or the south, notwithstanding that they began doing it last year. That's something to take note of. But previously, like in 2012, the Shekau faction was bombing churches, hitting them on Christmas, hitting them on Easter. And that was causing the Christian community in Nigeria to say, we need to rise up and do something against this. And that would put additional pressure on the government to get rid of this statelet. However, notwithstanding these few attacks that I just mentioned in the south, and actually a few that happened in central Nigeria, ISWAP has not been disturbing the Christian community outside of its own main territorial holdings in the northeast. So I would say for Christians in the south or the center of Nigeria, compared to a decade ago, they're largely undisturbed by the Boko Haram or ISWAP issue. And that's why they're not calling for the government to take more action. And that actually makes it a more tenable stranglehold on northeastern Nigeria for ISWAP. And that might even be a strategic thing for ISWAP to not antagonize the Christians so that it doesn't force the government's hand against their territorial holdings.
As you mentioned, it's not a static situation. I mean, ISWAP holding this territory is every day they're entrenching further, they're gathering more taxes, they're bringing up a new generation that perhaps will have a go at the cities at some point. In the kind of, I guess, the short and medium term, does ISWAP have any kind of vision outside of Nigeria, or is it really staying within that kind of frontier?
I think there had been times in ISWAP, or at least the Shekau faction's history, where they certainly had Lake Chad regional ambitions, broader Nigerian ambitions, and perhaps even broader African ambitions. However, those have not been realized, and I think this actually goes back to strategy. The group found that, and I think the neighboring countries of Niger, Chad, and Cameroon found that as long as they don't bother each other, then both sides won't attack each other too much. So the more that the Shekau faction ventured into those neighboring countries, the more those neighboring countries would crack down upon ISWAP or the Shekau faction in Nigeria. And I think those neighboring countries also realized the more that they help Nigeria, the more likely it is that the then Shekau faction would attack them. And because at the end of the day, the group is rooted in Nigeria, I think it's come to accept this sort of strategic limitation that it struggles to penetrate these neighboring countries. It's not really its home territory to the same extent. And the more that it tries to expand, the more pushback it's going to get from the region. So it's better off, at least for the time being, maintaining this fight against the Nigerian army that's actually only semi-committed to destroying the group. And so at least I think for the short to midterm, this is going to be a largely Nigerian affair. And ISWAP will largely use the neighboring countries for logistics quietly and not conduct these major attacks and accept that it has the limitation that it's not going to start conquering territory in these neighboring countries.
Slightly technical question that may be beyond your research area, but within ISWAP's propaganda, because at the center, ISIS at the center tends to fuse together this kind of local revolutionary cause, especially in Iraq, with the kind of global vision. Does ISWAP do the same thing, or is their propaganda almost entirely a kind of local revolutionary focus?
So one thing to note about ISWAP as well as the late Shekau faction is both are completely loyal to IS. And despite all of the tensions within these factions throughout the years, I've never seen anyone criticize or try to turn back on loyalty to IS. So they're completely loyal to IS. I don't think they use IS materials and speeches in their own sermons and their own educational materials as much as they used to, partly because IS might not be producing as much from the center, and perhaps IS is just not providing them with as much as they used to, given that it's struggling in Syria and Iraq. But no, the group is completely, committed to the caliphate, committed to the IS vision on one end. And I think that has served, if anything, as a buttress to ISWAP on the factional level in terms of Ansaru members joining it and Shekau faction members joining it. But in terms of winning over the local population, while there certainly were some recruits that were that were interested in the IS vision, I do think it's more of these Nigerian style narratives that have actually helped it do a more wider scale recruiting, because those are issues that are more pertinent to the typical Nigerian recruit. And on that note, I would say it's notable that although ISWAP has historically not commented too much on Nigerian politics, it did issue a video specifically ahead of the Nigerian elections condemning all of the Muslim leaders who support those elections. So I think the IS narrative and the more localized Nigerian narrative both serve purposes for ISWAP.
Makes sense. The last question before we go open. The West has obviously pulled a lot of its military forces out of Africa generally, actually, they're out of West Africa and the Sahel specifically. Is there anything you think we can do from the outside, or is it without force? Is it basically a lost cause?
I think if there was one thing I would mention, it would be that it's still important to study these groups and research these groups and provide information and analysis on the threats and trends of these groups to governments. What I would say outside researchers can't really control is where the government devotes its resources and its time. It seems that clearly that's committed to Eurasia now, but there likely will be a time in the cyclicality of foreign affairs where governments realize the pressing situation of the Sahel and come back to it. And it'll be very useful for those governments to have an available body of research that's kept up over time, over the past few years, even while the governmental attention was focused elsewhere. But I just think it's hard for us to tell the government or to make the government focus on the Sahel. We can only do our jobs to provide this strong analysis, and then it's sort of up to them to understand the pressingness of the issues.
I was sorry, I slightly confused things by saying we, and I meant we here in terms of our governments, not we analysts. Is there, if you were in, if you were in the position of advising government policy, is there anything you would advise them to be doing at the moment that could actually help mitigate the way things are going?
Well, I think at least in the case of ISWAP, if you're going to recommit to defeating the group, you're going to have to, I think, change the nature of, say, an army like the Nigerian army. I still think it's way too much of a conventional army designed for like a battle with another state, which is quite unlikely at the time. Whereas it should be an army, especially in the Northeast, more like the Chadian army, which is made for, desert warfare, being highly mobile. And I think that the Nigerian army has made that transition somewhat, but it's not made it as much as it needs to make it if it's ever going to defeat ISWAP. So, we don't need a Nigerian army. And I mean, Nigeria doesn't need an army like the one in Ukraine and Russia that are fighting a fairly conventional battle. But they do need one that's highly designed for a mobile counterinsurgency effort. So one thing I think they can do is, given the experience that the West has had in counterinsurgency for the last decade, is perhaps continuing to work on reconceptualizing the doctrines and the organizational structure of the Nigerian army, in addition to providing intelligence about financial links and perhaps surveillance movements and the like.
Makes sense. I want to go over to Pieter, and then I'll come back to you, Jacob, with the same question. How's the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban and the kind of the surge that ISKP has had since then, has that had much of a knock-on influence in the Sahel, or do those two theaters operate more or less autonomously?
They operate autonomously, but it has been pointed out that the financing for both groups, for a large part, came from Southern Africa. a few months ago, one of their officials was arrested in Southern Africa, and it has been pointed out, apparently, that he controlled the cash flow to several cells. So they are connected in a way, but operationally not at all.
Thank you. Over to you, Jacob.
Hello? Sorry.
Hello.
Should I have a go at that?
Yes, please.
About how the events of Afghanistan and are affecting ISWAP?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, it was complicated for ISWAP because on the one end, this was, you know, the group ISWAP originally, the predecessors like 20 years ago, venerated the Taliban and wanted to follow the Taliban's model. And as it turned out, you know, the Taliban ended up conquering territory. But the Taliban is aligned with Al-Qaeda, and for ISWAP, Al-Qaeda is a completely prohibited group. ISWAP is very against Al-Qaeda, completely loyal to IS. So you really didn't see anything about the success of Afghanistan in ISWAP or the late Shekau faction's materials, you know, or propaganda. That said, I wouldn't be surprised if it legitimized their longer term strategy.
Makes sense. I thought for the last bit we might shift the focus just slightly to Southern Africa, to ISIS's two, I guess, strongholds in the Congo and in Mozambique. Whereas we've also mentioned there is this network in South Africa that's we've got some more visibility on, but not a great deal. What kind of, how to phrase this? As you mentioned, there are kind of horizontal relations between these African branches at this moment. Is the relationship between the Sahel and these southern branches kind of in which direction does the dependency go? In other words, if there's a flow of funds, is it from ISWAP to the Congo, or is Mozambique and the kind of the mines there and things providing funds for the rest of the network? If I go to Pieter.
I don't exactly remember the content of that article again, but it was a document by the UN in which was clearly pointed out that there was some kind of financial hub running from inside Southern Africa, South Africa itself, the country, which provided cash flows, constant cash flows to ISIS throughout the entire continent and even to ISKP in Afghanistan. But that's about it. I don't remember the exact document. I don't have the time to look it up right now, but that happened. Not too bad.
I would only add that in many cases, the best place for a logistics hub and a financial hub is a place where there's actually not combat. And I would say that's why you consistently see these cases emerging from South Africa, because there's not much fighting there. And therefore governments, at least internationally, and perhaps even the own South African government, are not, you know, fully pressed on towards looking for terrorist links. Whereas when you're in a place where there's a lot of combat, you might have a lot of attention to that. So I would actually suspect that a lot of the action comes from places that may be seeing lesser levels of violence, and then two, the places that are seeing more levels of violence.
Just to follow on from that, I think this will be our last question, but to cover the one ISIS zone that we haven't done yet, which is Somalia. I think actually technically it's in Somaliland, isn't it? The ISIS presence now, just a few hundred troops, we're told by the latest UN report. Does the Sahel, or rather do the Sahel branches and ISWAP have much of a relationship with the Somali branch, or are they, or can we just not really see the links for now? Pieter, you first.
Well, basically, I haven't seen anything pointing to that. It is likely that there are connections, but I can't see any clear link between branches operating in the Sahel or with the ones operating in Central Africa, like, for example, Congo, Somalia, or Mozambique. Probably, again, there is a connection, cash flow, weapons, but maybe recruits, I don't know, but I haven't seen anything concrete yet.
Yeah, it's not like 10 years ago when there wasn't so much international attention towards these groups. Even with attention diverted to, say, Eurasia, there's still intelligence agencies tracking these groups. And it would make it very hard to travel to, say, Somalia from Nigeria and train, like happened 15 years ago. But we do sometimes see the propaganda outputs, of ISWAP showing videos from Somalia. And I think some other provinces have shown the ISWAP videos to their followers. So there is that morale support. And we did mention South Africa as a logistics base. I do think Sudan has been a quiet base for ISWAP logistics, funding, and some networks. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that was a country that doesn't get much attention, but that might also be a sort of hub for some types of contacts. But as Pieter noted, anything deeper is very hard for us to see, but we can suspect that it occurs.
Sorry, I said that would be the last question, but just to tack one last thing on to you, Jacob, just about Sudan. Has this been noticeably different since before and after the coup? In other words, has the new government made any effort to crack down on this stuff, or is it continuing as it was before?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's probably one that deserves additional research. From my very close tracking of ISWAP, the networks and individuals that I saw in Sudan were mostly active there like 3 or 4 years ago. So it does seem to me like after the coup, there's been less action there, but I can't verify it's either because of the coup or that the new administration is doing anything. It could just be that I'm not seeing those links, or ISWAP has done a better job of concealing them. But there have been some arrests of Nigerian jihadists in Sudan in the past 3 or 4 years. So I do think at the same time that we saw incidents of the coup developing, there were actually some crackdowns on ISWAP. Whether it's a correlation or not, I can't say, but I could say that in the last 2 or 3 years, I've seen less presence of ISWAP in Sudan than I saw, say, 4 or 5 years ago.
Thank you. Thank you both. That was a lot of ground to cover in a very short amount of time. Thank you for doing this. We hope to have you back at some point soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.